A lone rider comes out of the dusk, carrying dust, silence, and a past that won't let him go. When the night turned to fire, he bled to keep her standing, and she fought to keep him alive. The rider came out of the canyon shadows like a ghost that had ridden too long under the sun. Dust clung to him as if it feared to let go, coating his boots, his coat, the brim of his hat. His horse stumbled with weariness, ribs showing through a coat roughened by the miles. Beyond the open plain, the land stretched into silence, broken only by the solitary shape of a ranch house squatting beneath a bruised sky. A pale lamplight glimmered in one of its windows, a fragile beacon in the gathering dusk. It was not a light of welcome but of survival, faint, steady, unwilling to die. Sarah Calloway moved within that house, her hands busy with firewood and the blackened kettle that hissed faintly on the stove. She worked in silence, not because the world had gone quiet, but because grief had carved silence into her. Her husband had been dead 3 winters now, laid in the ground beneath the cottonwood that swayed at the edge of her property. His grave, marker, no more than a wooden cross hammered together in haste, had weathered gray, the name almost erased by wind and rain. She seldom spoke to it anymore. Words had run out. When the knock came, Sarah stiffened. It was not the hesitant tapping of a traveler in need, but the solid rap of one who carried no shame in asking. She set the kettle down, wiped her hands against her apron, and reached for the door. Her fingers hovered on the knob, heart pounding. With that old familiar unease. Outside stood a man scarred by sun and sorrow alike. His cheeks were hollow, his beard patchy, his coat torn where the stitching had given up. A rifle leaned against his shoulder, not gleaming, not proud, but battered and old, a tool long past its prime. His eyes, though, carried something that unsettled her more than any weapon, a weariness so deep it seemed permanent. "Evening," he said, his voice low, roughened by dust. Sarah's eyes narrowed. She knew this kind of man. Men who rode with pasts chasing after them. Men who ran because law or guilt, or both, pressed hard at their backs. Men of running. Men of blood. She considered shutting the door, but the land was harsh, and though her heart had stiffened in widowhood, it had not gone to stone. She tilted her chin, studied the horse behind him, foam at its mouth, a tremor in its legs. The beast would not last another night without shelter. Neither, perhaps, would the man. "The barn," she said, her voice flat without invitation but not without mercy. He tipped his hat, a gesture worn more from habit than pride. "Obliged." She watched him lead the horse toward the barn, each step marked with exhaustion. When she turned back to her hearth, her hands shook faintly. She pressed her palms against the table until the tremor passed. Men like him brought storms with them, storms that could tear the shingles off a life already too fragile. Yet she had let him in. Later, she lit a lantern and, against her better judgment, walked out to the barn. Shadows swayed on the walls as the stranger tended to his horse with quiet reverence, brushing dust from its coat, whispering to it as though to steady both of their hearts. He asked for nothing more than a patch of hay and a bucket of water. She handed him the water pail, her eyes lingering on the way his scarred hands moved, deliberate, careful, not wasteful. He did not drink first, though his lips cracked with thirst. Instead, he set the pail down for the horse. "You'll find no trouble from me, ma'am," he said softly, as though reading her fears. She gave no answer, only turned back toward the house. Yet as she walked, she felt the weight of her solitude more keenly than before. It had been years since another soul's presence stirred the air around her, years since the sound of boots on her porch or the cadence of a man's voice. At dusk, loneliness was a harsh master, and though she had endured it, she did not welcome its reminders. Inside, Sarah stood by the window, peering out at the barn. A single crack of lantern light glowed between the boards. She pressed her shawl tighter, around her shoulders, as though to shield herself from an unease she could not name. The land was wide, merciless, and often cruel. It tested everything that dared survive upon it. Perhaps this man was another test, of her caution, of her faith, of her own heart. As the night deepened, the wind carried the distant howl of coyotes. Sarah set another log on the fire and sat down in the rocking chair by the hearth. The wood creaked beneath her, the same creak that once sang beneath her husband's weight. The chair rocked forward, back, forward again, each motion steady, each one haunted Dot. Her eyes drifted shut, but rest would not come. Out in the barn, a stranger lay on hay, with only his horse and his sins for company. In her home, a widow clutched her shawl, listening to the coyotes cry. Both of them, alone, tethered by the thin thread of necessity. Suspicion hung in the air between them, unseen but heavy as iron. Yet something else stirred there too, quiet and unspoken. Recognition. One broken soul had crossed paths with another, and though the land itself seemed unwilling to judge, it seemed equally unwilling to grant either of them peace. The nights that followed passed like chapters written in silence. Daniel Hale lingered on the porch after his work was done, a shadow framed against the lantern's glow. He took his place in the old rocking chair, as though it had been waiting. For him, though the wood still seemed to remember another wait, another man. Each creak of its slow rhythm echoed through the house like the whisper of a ghost. Sarah watched him from behind the thin curtain. She told herself she did not care, yet her eyes sought him out night after night. There was something in the steadiness of his posture, the rifle propped against his leg, the way he seemed to listen to the far-off howls of coyotes. It unsettled her. This quiet guard who asked for nothing, gave nothing, yet sat there as if the ranch were his duty. Part of her bristled at it. This was her land, her home, her solitude earned by years of toil and grief. But another part, deep, hidden, rarely acknowledged, found a strange comfort in the rhythm of that chair. It was a sound she had once loved, when her husband had sat in it after a long day, boots kicked off, pipe smoke curling in the lamplight. Now it belonged to a stranger whose silence was heavier than words. For 3 nights he said little, his voice no more than a murmur when thanking her for food or water. Then on the 4th, as the prairie wind stirred dry grass and the moon hung cold above, he spoke. "I am a thief," he said, his voice carrying into the stillness. "And a murderer." The words fell like stones. Sarah's breath caught and her hand tightened on the curtain. For a moment she thought she might step out, drive him off her land, send him back into the wilderness that had carved his face with dust and scars. Yet she did not move. She stood rooted, her heart hammering, while the confession lingered in. The night like smoke that would not disperse. Daniel did not rise from the chair. He simply rocked once, twice, and stilled. "That's the truth of it," he said softly, "if you were wondering." Sarah turned from the window, pressing her palm to her chest. The house felt colder, the shadows deeper. Yet she did not reach for the rifle above the mantel. She did not bolt the door. Instead, her mind drifted to another day. Another man. Her husband had been gunned down in town, shot dead in a quarrel that was not his own. He had gone only to sell cattle, only to bring home coin for the winter, and never returned. Men had said it was misfortune, that he had been in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Yet Sarah knew it was more than that. Violence clung to some men like dust clings to boots. It spread to those around them, marked the innocent as well as the guilty. Her husband had paid the price. She had paid the price. Men wore their sins differently. Some bore them in scars across their faces, others in the silence that wrapped around them. Some were branded by rumor, others by memory. And some, like Daniel, branded themselves with words too heavy to take back. The next morning she set his plate of bread and coffee on the porch rail. He nodded thanks, but said nothing more of the night before. The silence between them had changed, though. It was no longer empty but crowded with things unspoken. That afternoon the sound of hooves broke across the prairie. 3 men rode past the fence line, townsmen Sarah recognized by face if not by name. They slowed their horses, their eyes sweeping, over the ranch house, over the figure of Daniel leaning against the porch post. "Well now," one called, his voice dripping with scorn. "Widow Calloway's hired herself a drifter." The others chuckled, mean laughter carried by the wind. "Careful, ma'am," another jeered. Men like him don't work for nothing. They take. Sarah stood at the steps, hands clenched, in her apron. Her cheeks burned, though she kept her chin high. Daniel said nothing. He simply shifted his stance, his eyes steady on the riders, not defiant, but unflinching. The townsmen grew restless under that gaze and rode on, spitting dust. Behind them, when they were gone, Sarah turned to him. Anger and shame knotted in her throat, not at him but at them, at herself, at the loneliness that had left her vulnerable to their sneers. "I don't need protection," she said, more sharply than she intended. Daniel looked at her, the scar, by his jaw deepening as his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Didn't say you did." He returned to the rocking chair, as if the interruption had been no more than wind. Sarah lingered at the door, trembling though she could not say why. She thought of the words he had spoken the night before, of the men's mocking laughter, of her own widowhood that branded her as surely as his past branded him. She understood in that moment a truth she had never put to words. Rejection was a kind of hunger, a starvation of the soul. She had felt it in the eyes of the town when they looked at her not as Sarah but as the widow. He had felt it too, in the eyes of men who saw only outlaw, never man. Different paths, the same emptiness. That night, as coyotes howled again, and the chair creaked its slow rhythm, Sarah did not watch from the curtain. She sat in her own chair by the hearth, shawl drawn close, listening. She let the sound fill the silence, let it remind her that though ghosts lingered and sins clung, two souls could share a night without judgment, bound by the weight of what they had lost. The evening began with stillness, the kind of silence that often foreshadows change. The air lay heavy, the sky smeared in bruised colors as the sun slid behind the horizon. Sarah stood at the sink, drying her hands on a cloth, when the first low rumble trembled across the plains. She paused, listening. Another followed, closer, heavier. Storms moved quickly here, crossing miles in minutes, swallowing sky and earth alike. By the time she lit the lamps, the wind had risen. Dust scratched at the windows, shutters clattered against the frame. In the barn, Daniel was likely bedding down as he did most nights, wrapped in his coat, horse nearby. She hesitated, hand on the latch. The night would be cruel. To leave him there seemed less mercy than punishment. When the rain came, it came hard. Sheets of water slapped against the roof, forcing through cracks to drip down the walls. With a sharp breath, Sarah threw on her shawl and opened the door. Daniel stood at the edge of the porch already, hat pulled low, coat soaked through. He had been waiting, perhaps reluctant to impose. "Inside," she said. Her voice was firm, though not unkind. He tipped his head, stepped past her into the glow of firelight. The room seemed smaller with him there, filled with the scent of rain and leather, the sound of water dripping from his coat onto the floorboards. Sarah shut the door against the wind and added wood to the fire. Daniel stood by the hearth, his face revealed in the shifting glow. The scars across his temple caught the light, casting shadows that seemed deeper than flesh. His eyes, dark and unsteady, betrayed not fear of the storm but something else, a heaviness, as though the years themselves weighed upon him. His hands trembled slightly when he reached toward the heat. Sarah noticed and said nothing. She poured coffee instead, set the cup before him. The crack of thunder rolled above, shaking the rafters, rattling the crockery on the shelves. He sat finally, the chair groaning under his weight, steam rising from the cup in his hands. For a long while neither spoke. The fire popped. The storm lashed. Sarah's gaze lingered on the rifle leaning by the door. It was her husband's once, oiled and ready, its presence as much a warning as a comfort. Daniel's eyes flicked to it, then away as though he too carried its burden in silence. When he did speak, his voice was quieter than the storm, but heavier than the thunder. "Hunger'll drive a man to things he swore he'd never do," he said. "I was younger, foolish. Took what wasn't mine. Food, coin, horses." Sarah's stomach tightened. She kept her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes fixed on him, waiting. "Men came after me," he went on, staring into the fire. One of 'em carried a grudge longer than sense. Came at me with a knife. I had nothing but my own hands. When it was over, he was gone, and I was branded for it. Thief, killer, outlaw. His jaw worked, as if chewing on memories that never softened. Lightning cracked outside, brightening the room in a sudden white flare. In that flash, Sarah saw him more clearly than before. Not the gaunt drifter with a rifle too old for killing, but a man who had lived every day since beneath a noose only he could see. He lifted the cup, his hands unsteady. The storm outside. He gestured to the roaring dark beyond the windows. Ain't half the storm inside. Sarah swallowed hard. Her throat ached with unspoken words. Part of her recoiled from his confession, horrified that she had let such a man sit at her table, breathe her air. Yet another part felt something else, an unexpected, unwanted pity. She knew what it was to be haunted, to live in the long shadow of loss. Perhaps his ghosts were different, but they were ghosts all the same. Thunder shook the house again, louder this time. The horses screamed from the barn, hooves striking wood. Sarah rose, but Daniel was quicker. He moved to the door in 2 strides, pulling it open against the wind and rain. Lightning split the sky, striking a cottonwood not far from the gravesite. The tree cracked, splintered, flames hissing in the downpour. The horses bucked in terror, slamming against their stalls. Daniel leapt down the steps, mud splashing around his boots. Sarah followed to the porch, shawl clutched tight, rain pelting her face. He entered the barn like a man born to calm chaos. His voice cut through the storm steady, low. He pressed his hand to a horse's muzzle, stroking it until the frantic rolling of its eyes stilled. Another kick shook the walls, and he braced his shoulder, calming the beast until it too quieted. His movements were firm but tender, his words soft as prayer. Sarah stood watching, water soaking her hair, her shawl heavy as stone. In that moment, she did not see the thief, the murderer, the outlaw he named himself. She saw only a man shouldering burdens with a strength that came not from violence but from endurance, a man who carried his own gallows within him, yet still found room to steady the lives around him. When at last the storm began to ease, Sarah returned inside. Daniel followed, soaked to the bone, yet silent, his face unreadable. She handed him a towel, and he took it with a nod, wringing water from his hair. Neither spoke as they sat again by the fire, the house trembling less with each passing moment. The rifle still leaned by the door, a silent reminder of choices, of blood, of judgment yet to come. But Sarah's eyes no longer lingered on it. Instead, they rested on the man before her, wounded, weary, but present. She felt the weight of her fear. Yes, but also something else rising quietly in its place. For the first time, she wondered if mercy was braver than fear. The storm passed in the night, leaving the world washed clean and strangely hollow. The prairie stretched damp and silver beneath the pale morning sun. Birds sang hesitantly, as though uncertain the rage of wind and rain would not return. Inside, the ranch house, the silence that followed seemed heavier than the storm itself. Daniel now sat at Sarah's table, no longer confined to the barn. He ate his bread and drank his coffee with the quiet gratitude of a man unaccustomed to being offered a place. His presence filled the small kitchen, crowding the air with things unspoken. Sarah moved about the room, setting down plates, tending the fire. Her every step weighted with unease. It was not only danger she felt in him now. There was something else. Companionship she had long denied herself. Companionship she had taught herself to fear. Their conversations were clipped, no more than a few words exchanged over tasks or meals. Yet each word seemed to matter. Fence. Wires loose along the south pasture, he said one morning, his voice low but certain. I know, she replied, not looking at him. I'll mend it. Her eyes flicked to him then, catching the sincerity in his expression. She wanted to refuse, to remind him it was not his place, but instead she found herself nodding. You'll find the tools in the shed. So it became. Daniel mended what was broken, his hands moving with patience, his silence steady as the rhythm of work. Sarah watched him sometimes through the window, the way he tied knots with slow precision, as if weaving penance into every strand of rope. The way he sharpened, tools not hurriedly but carefully as though each blade held history worth respecting. The sight unsettled her. She remembered the chest upstairs, where her wedding dress lay folded, yellowed with time, stiff with years of disuse. Once it had been a symbol of vows spoken with hope. Now it was a relic of gunfire and loss, tucked away like a secret too heavy to face. When she glimpsed Daniel at her table, she felt a pang that was both treacherous and alive, an ache that reminded her she was still flesh, still capable of longing. But the world beyond her fences had sharp eyes and sharper tongues. Word traveled quickly in small places. It reached her ears in the market, whispered behind hands, muttered at the well. The widow and the drifter, the widow and the outlaw. One afternoon, as she loaded supplies onto her wagon, a woman she knew only distantly leaned close, voice low but edged. "You ought to be careful, Sarah. Men like that bring nothing but ruin. Folks are watching." Sarah held her chin high, said nothing, but the words stung like nettles. By the time she returned home, her hands ached from clutching the reins. Too tightly. The sheriff came not long after. Dust clung to his coat as he rode up, the sun glinting on the badge pinned to his chest. His horse stamped impatiently as he swung down and knocked at her door. Daniel was on the porch, oiling the hinges of the rocking chair. He stood as the sheriff approached, face impassive, body still. Sarah opened the door, her heart tight in her chest. "Afternoon, Mrs. Calloway," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. His gaze slid to Daniel, lingering on the scar that cut across his temple. "You've taken on some help, I hear." Sarah steadied her voice. "A man lends a hand. I give him supper. That's all." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "That's so? You know his name?" "Daniel Hale," she answered before Daniel could. The sheriff turned the name over like a coin on his tongue. "Not a name I've heard round here." "Where's he from?" Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Sarah stepped forward, the door frame at her back, the weight of her husband's rifle hanging just inside. "He's from nowhere that concerns you. He works. He earns his keep." The sheriff studied her, then Daniel, suspicion sharp as a knife's edge. The silence stretched, thick as the summer heat. At last he spat into the dirt, tugged at his reins. "Just be sure, Mrs. Calloway. Some men bring more shadow than light. I'd hate to see trouble land at your door." With that, he mounted and rode away, leaving dust swirling in his wake. Sarah closed the door, her hands trembling. Behind her, Daniel's voice came low, almost regretful. "You shouldn't have spoken for me." She turned, anger flashing in her chest. "And let him drag you off because you've got scars and silence. I know what that feels like, to be judged by whispers, by what folks think they know." Her voice cracked despite her effort to steady it. She drew her shawl tight, turning away from him. Doubt gnawed at her heart. Had she defended him because it was just, or because she feared the loneliness that would settle heavier than ever if he were gone? Daniel said nothing more. He returned to the rocking chair, his hands steady as he resumed his work on the hinges. The creak of the wood rose again, filling the silence between them. That night, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling beams. The house felt taut, as though the storm had never truly left. Desire and distrust twisted together inside her, each breath a reminder of the fragile, dangerous thing growing beneath her roof. It frightened her, and yet impossibly it made her feel alive. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that settles after rain has scoured the earth. The prairie lay under a pale half-moon, hushed but watchful. Inside the house, Sarah stirred the last embers of the hearth fire, the shawl about her shoulders, warding off the chill that crept along the floorboards. Daniel sat on the porch, as he often did, the rocking chair moving in its slow, measured rhythm. But the quiet was not to last. The horses whinnied first, restless in the dark. Then came the low rumble of hooves from beyond the rise, not the steady, beat of travelers, but the quickened thunder of men riding hard. Sarah froze, her hand tightening around the iron poker. Daniel rose at once, stepping into the yard, his eyes narrowing toward the horizon. From the shadows spilled riders, half a dozen, maybe more, faces painted with anger and old grudges. Their shouts cut across the night, and the crack of rifles followed. The barn shuddered under the sudden blaze of gunfire. Daniel moved with the swiftness of a man long acquainted with violence. He pulled his old rifle from the corner of the porch, working the lever smooth as breath. "Inside," he barked, though his voice carried no panic, only grim certainty. But Sarah did not retreat. She seized the shotgun from above the mantel, stepping into the doorway, the boards cold beneath her bare feet. Her heart thundered, yet her hands were steady. This was her home, her land, the last remnant of a life already half taken. She would not surrender it. The raiders circled, whooping, firing shots that splintered the fence posts. A lantern fell near the barn, flames leaping to the dry straw, shadows twisted against the walls, grotesque and flickering. Daniel fired, dropping a man from his saddle. He reloaded with a fluid motion, the kind born of desperation rather than pride. Another shot, another rider down. Yet still they came, anger driving them harder than fear. Sarah lifted her shotgun, the weight familiar though it had been years since she'd aimed at more than coyotes. She fired once, the recoil jarring her shoulder, but the rider she'd aimed at fell, his cry swallowed by the night. Her blood surged, fierce and alive, carrying her through the smoke and thunder. Then came the moment that split the night open. A rider broke from the circle, charging straight for the porch, rifle raised. Sarah leveled her shotgun, but before she could fire, Daniel stepped in front of her. The shot cracked, and Daniel staggered, his body absorbing the bullet meant for her heart. Sarah's scream was lost in the chaos. She dropped to her knees beside him, her shawl falling into the dirt. With trembling hands, she pressed it hard against the wound at his side, the fabric soaking red. "Stay with me," she whispered, the words rushing out before she could think. Not prayers for her husband, long gone beneath the cottonwood, but desperate pleas for this scarred man who had stood between her and death. "Don't you dare leave me here alone." Daniel gritted his teeth, his face pale under the firelight. "Keep your head down," he rasped, trying to push her away, but his strength faltered. The raiders, seeing their numbers broken, and the widow fighting like a she-wolf beside her wounded defender, pulled back. Their shouts faded into the distance, as they vanished into the night, leaving only smoke, silence, and the acrid stench of gunpowder. The barn smoldered, flames licking at the roof until Daniel's horse kicked the door open and fled into the pasture, whinnying against the rising smoke. Sarah wanted to chase after it, to save what little they had left, but her hands were locked against Daniel's wound, her shawl pressed to keep him tethered to this earth. His breathing came shallow, each gasp a knife. "Told you. I was no good," he muttered, voice ragged. She shook her head fiercely, her tears falling onto his shirt, mingling with blood. "You're a fool if you think that. You stood for me, you bled for me. That is more than most men would ever do." He tried to smile, but the effort twisted into a grimace. His hand, trembling, found hers where she held the cloth. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the crackle of dying fire and the night wind moving through the cottonwoods. When at last the flames dwindled and the silence stretched, Sarah looked at him anew. Not as the thief and murderer he had named himself, not as the outlaw the town whispered about, but as the man who had shielded her with his own body, who had stood between her and the grave. Her home lay scarred, the barn blackened, the fences broken, but her heart stirred with a recognition deeper than gratitude. She had not begged for her husband to return from his deathbed, nor had she pleaded with God to undo what was lost. Yet tonight, in the smoke and ruin, she had prayed for Daniel Hale. The fire had left its mark, inside and out. It had burned away, some measure of fear, and in its ashes something fragile but undeniable remained. Survival, yes, but more than that. A bond forged not in tenderness but in shared blood and smoke, in sacrifice neither had asked for, yet both had chosen. As she bound his wound as best she could, her shawl torn and ruined, Sarah whispered again, not prayers but promises. You will not die here, Daniel. Not while I have strength to keep you. And in the flickering aftermath, with smoke curling to the stars, he closed his eyes, not in surrender, but in trust. Word of the raid did not take long to spread. By dawn, smoke still curled above the blackened barn, and the prairie seemed to whisper the tale along every fence line, across every trail into town. Men notice when shots are fired in the night. Men talk when blood is spilled on a widow's land. The sheriff rode up before noon, his horse lathered, his coat flecked with dust. 2 deputies trailed behind him, their rifles easy in their hands. Sarah stood on the porch, her shawl pulled, tight about her shoulders, her eyes hollow from a night spent without sleep. Inside, Daniel rested in the chair, pale but upright, the bandage at his side seeping through. The sheriff dismounted slow, his gaze fixed on Daniel as though measuring the weight of a noose. I heard there was trouble, he said, his voice sharp as iron. Raiders, they tell me, and a drifter with a gun in the middle of it. Sarah's heart pounded, but she held her ground. That's the truth, she said. Raiders came in the night. They fired shots, set the barn ablaze. If not for Daniel Hale, I'd be buried in the cottonwoods beside my husband. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, boots thudding against the porch. Is that so? Funny thing, Mrs. Calloway. You speak of gratitude, but what I see is a wanted man sitting at your table. A man who's carried more death on his back than most. The law don't weigh mercy. Daniel stirred then, his voice low, steady despite the pain in his side. Sheriff, you want me, I won't fight you. But hear this. Those raiders weren't riding for me. They came for what they always come for, to take what ain't theirs. The woman had the courage to stand. I did what any man ought. Silence fell heavy. The deputies shifted, uneasy in the heat. The sheriff studied Daniel, then Sarah, his jaw working beneath his whiskers. For a long moment, the only sound was the creak of the rocking chair behind her, a sound once tied to absence, now carrying something else. Presence, defiance, a heartbeat still alive. At last the sheriff let out a slow breath. Law says I ought to drag him back to town. But law don't always stand taller than truth. You're alive because of him. That I can't ignore. His eyes flicked to Daniel once more. You stay quiet, Hale. You keep to her fences. You keep trouble off her land. That's the only mercy you'll get. With that, he swung into his saddle, the deputies following. Dust rose as they rode away, leaving silence behind. Sarah turned. Daniel was already pushing to his feet, swaying slightly as the effort tore at his wound. It won't last, he said, voice rough. So long as I'm here, questions will follow. Men don't forget I should ride on. She stepped toward him, her hands tightening in the shawl. And leave me to rebuild alone? Leave the fences, the barn, the nights? You don't need my shadow across your land, he said. I'm nothing but the worst thing I've done. Her breath caught, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. No, Daniel. A man is more than that. A man is the choices he makes. After. You stood for me when death came riding. Don't you tell me that means nothing. For a long time they stood there, the dawn light spilling across the porch, painting the worn boards gold. The rocking chair shifted in the breeze, its creak soft but insistent, no longer empty, no longer only a memory of the dead. Daniel looked past her, toward the horizon stretching wide and merciless. He limped down the steps, where his horse waited, reins slack, patient as stone. With effort he mounted, every motion slow with pain. Sarah followed, her boots striking the earth. She watched him gather the reins, watched him set his jaw like a man ready to ride until the world forgot him. Then she reached out. Her hand closed around the bridle leather, stopping the horse with a quiet strength. Neither spoke. The silence between them was its own language, not possession, not forgiveness, but the fragile beginning of something that might endure. Her hand on the reins was not a command, but an anchor, a promise that he need not ride alone into the emptiness again. Daniel's Eyes met hers. There was no vow, no sudden rush of romance, only a flicker of recognition. Two broken souls who had weathered fire together, who had found in one another the barest thread of belonging. The prairie wind moved through the cottonwoods, whispering against the leaves. Behind them the house stood scarred yet unfallen, the graves beneath the trees holding the past but no longer chaining the living. Daniel exhaled, slow, as though laying down a weight he had carried for too many miles. He did not dismount, but neither did he urge the horse forward. Sarah's hand remained on the reins, steady, unflinching. In that silence lay the truth. Survival, dignity, the faintest edge of healing. Not the end of sorrow, but the chance to live with it and still find warmth in the firelight. And for the first time in years, Sarah felt the dawn not as an ending, but as a beginning.